Oh, we're now streaming live. I see that. Great.
Look at that. Okay, cool. All right. That's good. Which means I might as well start the recording here as well. And then.
No pressure, Nora.
No pressure.
Yeah, exactly. Now everybody, yeah.
My dad wants to make a Mark Zuckerberg joke right now.
And then let's see. If I mute everybody, can I then allow to unmute? Great. So then, Nora, you should be able to unmute yourself. Oh, I can unmute you too.
Okay, got it.
There we go. Cool. Okay, so welcome everybody. This is really thrilling. This is our second Zoom remote virtual Zorab Information Center enrichment evening. Since I know that we've got a good number of people here who are not usually with us in New York, and even additions from last time, let me go ahead and introduce myself. My name is Dr. Christopher Sheckman. I'm the director of the Zorab Information Center. And the Zorab Information Center is an Armenian studies library, teaching, research center, information center that is attached to the Eastern Diocese of the Armenian Church of America, located in New York. Unfortunately, we are closed as you know, physically, as most places and things are at this moment. And luckily, I've had some really wonderful and adaptable folks who were scheduled to come and speak to us at the Guild Hall in the middle of Manhattan, who have been willing to take this venture with us into Zoom presentations. So it's been really, really thrilling. Let me just say a couple things. What I've done at the center with these enrichment evenings is that every sort of season, I come up with a theme, and then I also have some things that are kind of beyond the theme. And so Nora this evening is going to be really wonderful because I'm sure everybody here is aware that tomorrow is April 24th, which is, of course, this year the 105th anniversary commemorating the Armenian genocide. And in the last couple of years, I've tried to schedule things that are outside whatever the theme is, but related to in kind of more oblique ways than normal to the genocide, instead of kind of the usual. I've tried to kind of think about things that might be related but not exactly. So last year we had Keith David Wattenpau, who does a history of humanitarianism and is very much connected to the genocide, but is sort of not directly, say, a historian of it. And tonight, I'm really, really happy to have with us Nora Lessersohn, who is going to tell us a little bit about who at least claimed to be the sort of the first Armenian in New York. And you know, I will take, actually, Nora was the one who noted that it might actually be really lovely to think about a different New York than the one that we are currently experiencing, and to kind of think about New York City at a different time and place. And then thinking, you know, again, about tomorrow. This is a man who was in New York and kind of made himself an Ottoman representative and an Ottoman Armenian representative during the period of the Tanzimat, you know, during times that are seen as sort of leading up to the genocide, but obviously before it. So I think that it should hopefully be a nice thing to think about New York under different circumstances, and also a kind of give us a long view, say, for thinking about tomorrow as we do whatever kind of commemoration is possible under the circumstances this year. So I'm really, really thrilled to have Nora with us. Nora Lessersohn is a PhD student in United States U.S. history at University College London, and I don't know why that like tickles me so much. The idea of like being at a British university, like studying U.S. history, just feels, I don't know, there's something quite wonderful about that. We're going to get to hear a little bit about her dissertation research and the character that is sort of central to her dissertation. She is supported in her studies by a Kalous Gulbenkian Armenian Studies Scholarship. She's got a master's, an AM in Middle Eastern Studies from Harvard, and a bachelor's in the study of religion from Harvard. I actually first met Nora at a conference in London several years ago at Birkbeck College when we were talking about Ottoman cosmopolitanisms. And she was presenting on some of her earlier research, which I suspect informs what she does, but kind of takes a little bit of a turn from it. So I am excited personally to hear the new research that she's done since, I mean, what is that now? Six years ago now at this point.
Forget about
so
it.
I'm excited to hear her new work. And I also should mention that both Nora and I are members of the Society for Armenian Studies. And we work together as editorial members of the new e-SAS entries in the Society for Armenian Studies, a new sort of online forum for Armenian Studies scholarship. So that's our plug for the Society for Armenian Studies and for e-SAS. So those are some of the wonderful credentials, and I'm just really thrilled that Nora has joined us, and I'm excited to hear her. So you can, everybody can do their so we know how to do reaction, so we can welcome Nora there with our little clapping there. So Nora, I'll let you take it away.
Okay, great. Should I share my screen now?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, I'll share my screen. Hold on. Share screen. Share screen. Share. Present. Okay, so thanks so much, Chris, for having me. I really, really appreciate this. You also set up a lot of what I'm going to talk about quite beautifully. I appreciate everyone, all the friendly faces who are very literally faces on my screen right now. I keep making the joke that you're a really, truly captive audience, and so I very much appreciate you coming tonight. And given the format, I really thought I wanted to present more than read, to really introduce Oskanian and his work in New York City, and as Chris was saying, to really bring his New York to life. So I would love to hear what interests you, what surprises you, what questions you have based on what you hear. I'm currently writing the first chapter of my dissertation, but I've been working on this project in some way for about 5 years. So a lot of the research is already under my belt. So as Chris mentioned, I think it helps for me to describe how I first learned about Christopher Oskanian, who was an Ottoman Armenian man. He crossed my path while I was researching the lives of other Armenians from the Ottoman Empire in New York, specifically my family. This right here is my grandma's family. I know my grandma's watching right now on Facebook. In this photo, they're at Lido Beach on Coney Island. My great-grandmother is the one, I think that's a carpet in her hand on the far left. My great-grandfather is the one on the far right in the second row. And then my great-great-grandmother is the one where my arrow is right now, the older woman in the second row. So as some of you know, my grandfather's father, my great-grandfather, Hovhanessar John Charishian, left us a lot of memory work that I've been able to use in my research, in my history research. He came to New York after the genocide in the early 1920s, and as we discussed, we celebrate that yearly tomorrow. The picture here is my great-grandfather with his fellow members of the New York chapter of the Union of Marash Armenians at the beginning of the 1930s. And Marash is the name of the town in Turkey that he was from. I believe there's someone watching who's also has an ancestor in this photo, so that's really cool and really nice. On the left-hand side of the screen, you can see his business card from his shoemaking shop. He was a shoemaker, and it was at 159 East 28th Street. So you'll see throughout the presentation that I'm going to emphasize and bring to light a lot of the addresses in New York that we are made aware of. So, and then this last image is the name of the article that I wrote about his memoir. And so as you can see from the title, I was researching cosmopolitanism to learn more about my great-grandfather's life and kind of to describe the complexities of the Ottoman world he described. At the time I was researching, I couldn't find out much that matched what was written about in his memoir. It wasn't the history books, and the memoir didn't seem to be talking about the same place, a world where my great-grandfather could be friends with Turkish people and business partners, where he could enjoy speaking Turkish, where he could volunteer to serve in the Ottoman army. And so I went about sort of conceptualizing that, and I was very, very moved by his portrayal of extreme genocidal violence and loss and anger, but in tandem with really evident warmth and love for his life in Ottoman Marash and for the people who lived there. And so this is the long way of saying that during this time, I went to a presentation on Ottoman cosmopolitanism, and a single Ottoman Armenian man was presented as an example, as the classic example of an Ottoman cosmopolitan. And his name was Christopher Oskanian. So now as we start this whirlwind overview of Oskanian's life in New York, it's 7:17, so I'll just keep track of time for everybody. I wanted to ask you to look for a few things as I talk. So what surprises you or sticks out to you? What do you find most interesting? What changes do you see over time? What stays the same over time? And for our New Yorkers, or really anyone who keep track of what the addresses you see, what are they telling us about life and business for people like Oskanian, at least during this time? So as far as I can tell right now, Oskanian was the first American to come to the post-1776 United States. He arrived in 1834, probably age 16, to study civil engineering at what is now NYU. So this image here is of the registrar where he signed his name in Armenian letters and also indicated that he was from Constantinople, present-day Istanbul. Although the details aren't crystal clear right now, he was definitely associated with American missionaries in Constantinople who had arrived there in 1831, and they presumably facilitated this step of his education. NYU's activities at this time were based in a place called Clinton Hall, which is at Beekman and Nassau Streets in Lower Manhattan, which was really a hub of activity at this time in the 1830s. So in 1835, a year after he arrived, he gave his first public lectures on the topics of Armenia and education among the Armenians. Public lectures were a very popular form of entertainment and social activity during this time. People would literally go on dates to lectures. You would get a discount if you went as a woman and a man. So it sounds kind of stuffy to us, but it was the thing to do. His first lecture on education, I think, doubled as an appeal to support the efforts of the American missionaries in building schools for Armenians in Turkey, which was one of their main objectives in the empire at that time. His second lecture, while also an appeal in many ways, was delivered before a literary club at NYU, also at Clinton Hall. And this was the same year, actually, that NYU moved uptown to Greenwich Village in 1835. So you can see in both of these lectures that Oskanian is appealing to ancient and biblical pasts of the Armenians. And in the second especially, he is speaking negatively of the despotic tyrants who rule over his people, so the Ottomans. And he laments the loss of Armenia's independence and political glory. So these are some very early ways in which he's speaking about Armenia and the fact that Armenians are subjects to an imperial power. This is kind of just a fun slide about how recently on social media I've seen narratives about Armenia that are in some ways very consistent with what Oskanian was saying in 1835. So I just wanted to throw these here. We can come back to them at the end, but one is from Facebook and one is from the Balkan Armenian, which was a New York restaurant right near where my great-grandfather's shoe business actually was. So now Oskanian leaves NYU 2 years after he starts, and he seems to have worked as a civil engineer during that time. What comes kind of as a surprise is that in 1838, he starts to give lectures on Constantinople and the domestic manners, customs, and costumes of the Turks. So given what he said previously about his imperial overlords, we may expect these lectures to be extremely anti-Ottoman. And yet they're instead very sympathetic portraits of the people of Turkey, designed to counter the negative stereotypes really with which Americans would be most familiar. He took issue, for example, with some of the depictions in popular travel books from the time, such as Miss Pardoe's City of the Sultan and Domestic Manners of the Turks from 1836. So actually, interestingly, one of the things he talks about is how she says that they're all really lazy, but she was actually talking about Ramadan. She visited during Ramadan when they're fasting and, napping most of the day, which actually starts today. So he's trying to explain that, if she had just a little bit more cultural literacy, she might have understood what she was seeing and not lapsed into these stereotypes of the Turks. And at the end of one of these lectures, he even talks about himself as an Ottoman. He explains that his reaction is a typical Ottoman reaction to something. So now by 1839, Oskanian is naturalized as an American citizen, which is super early for someone from this part of the world. It probably makes him one of the first, if not the first, Middle Eastern American, as we'd say now. One thing I love is that on his passport, you can see that he was 5 feet 11 and a quarter inches, which is actually the height of my fiance. So I feel like I have a very good idea of how tall Oskanian was. I actually named this document in my computer Oskanian height. And when I showed this to my advisor, he was really interested in the question of passports and, what it meant to have a passport so early. And here I was like, but we know how tall he was now. That's so cool. And so that's kind of the kind of historian I am. But I think it's super interesting. And so in December of 1839, he married a woman named Maria Louisa Skinner, who really sadly I don't have a photo of, but she was the daughter of a very prominent minister at this time named Reverend Thomas Harvey Skinner. He was one of the founders of Union Theological Seminary, which is now up by Columbia. At the time, it was down at 9 University Place, which is by NYU and where everything else was sort of growing at this time. So you could sort of imagine how after 1838, when Union came about, social circles might have overlapped. I don't know how they met. I would love to know how they met because it does seem unusual to me that this very prominent American woman married an Ottoman Armenian man at this time. But right now I have no more information about that. So now in 1840, Oskanian returned with his new wife to Constantinople, right at the start of the Tanzimat reforms, which Chris mentioned earlier. They were about to take effect. They were basically a series of reforms aimed at modernization, westernization, consolidation, as well as establishing, at least theoretically, more legal and social equity among the ethno-confessional communities of the Islamic Empire. And historically, the Ottoman Empire was organized by difference and by hierarchy, with the Muslim Turks obviously being at the top. And so this was a real change, or at least a real attempt at change at that time. The clip on this slide right here, which is talking about Oskanian's return to Turkey, mentions that the Great Moral Revolution is happening at this time in Turkey. And so that's the Tanzimat. He lives in Constantinople with his family for the next 14 years. They have all 4 of their children there. And at the end of that period, in 1854, he goes to London and opens this museum, this Oriental and Turkish museum, which you can see the cover of the catalog for on the right. And he actually opens that with another Ottoman Armenian. And basically, this is right during the Crimean War. He is looking to educate British people about their new ally, the Ottoman Empire. And so this is a museum of wax figures, so like Madame Tussauds, and they're all arranged in vignettes. So, here's a bunch of wax figures in a Turkish bath. Here they are in a coffee house. Here's an Armenian wedding. And they were written about really for their detail. Like there was hair on the arms, and it was really as true to life as can be. And I just, I wish I could see what that really looked like. I think it would be so interesting. So for reasons I don't know at all, Oskanian and his family moved back to New York City in 1855, where he would remain for the rest of his life. He quickly established a Turkish coffee house, or kahve, at 625 Broadway, right around the corner from his first residence back in New York City at 62 Bleecker Street. There's now a Chipotle at that address, in case anyone's wondering. The kahve comes as part of a long tradition of Ottoman coffee houses as social spaces, as really important social spaces, where news was shared, where stories were shared, anything you can imagine that a social space would facilitate. And you can see that in the pictures on this slide. Basically images at top from 18th century, 19th century, and 20th century. Oskanian's shop included Turkish goods, so dresses, slippers, water pipes, nargile. The main room was lined with cushioned benches, as you can see pretty clearly in that 18th century photo at top. And it was filled by 7 tables where guests could drink coffee, where they could eat food or play chess or chat. There was a small library, I love this detail, with Persian poetry and European travel logs and history books and other, Oriental titles, as he would say. And one of my favorite details is that he put a Quran and a Bible like on top of each other, on top of the shelf. And I love that kind of visual analogy. I think it's very sweet. And the New York Chess Club also fittingly would play their matches in the coffee house. So it's just a really fun place, it seems like. The shop failed after a year, sadly. It seems like he was really too far ahead of the Starbucks curve. But the descriptions of the coffee house, like you see on this right-hand side, are some of my absolute favorite sources. They really seem to capture Oskanyan's desire to transport Constantinople to Manhattan. He wanted to, quote, cultivate friendly relations between Turks and Americans, by having them meet in an unrestrained and social way. He literally just wanted to have Americans and Turks chat. Now, there were very few Turks in America at this time, so maybe that's partly why it failed, because he didn't have enough of a clientele. Whereas around the same time, for example, in San Francisco, there was a huge Chinese immigrant community, and that's why Chinese restaurants started to take off. So I just really think that this speaks volumes as to Oskanyan's sort of ambitions and goals. He also wanted to institute a Turkish bath at this time, which did not take off. You'll note, if you can see in the article on the right, that the author says Oskanyan is thoroughly American in his appearance and costume, with the exception of the Turkish fez, which he hopes he will always wear. So now this is an image of the fez, Oskanyan in the fez look, around the same time as the coffee house, which you'll see repeated throughout his time in New York City, basically to the end of his life. The photo, which is a print here in the newspaper, was taken by Matthew Brady, who was a famous photographer, whose studio at 359 Broadway during this time was about a 15-minute walk from the coffee house. Now, along with the coffee house, Oskanyan began to give lectures on the topic of Turkey and its people. He was not the only lecturer talking about the quote-unquote East, but he seems to have made the sales pitch that he was a native speaker, and as such, he was the only one who could provide the insight that no one else could. So as you can see in the article, it's like a Turk lecturing on Turkey. So that was kind of the sales pitch. You could compare this approach to one of the most popular lecturers and speakers at the time, Bayard Taylor, who we're going to talk about in just one second. But just I want to note first that this lecture was held at the Mercantile Library, which was on Astor Place in Lafayette. So again, really close to all the other NYU locations. So I think this detour is warranted. This is Bayard Taylor. He was a very popular poet, travel writer, future diplomat at this time. Something is bleeping, oops, sorry, on my screen. He spoke about his travels to many places, including the Ottoman domains. His big topic around 1854 was the Arabs, and he was super enthusiastic about that subject, claiming also to correct common misunderstandings, but he also, like many others, would fall back on common stereotypes. He emphasized the adventurous nature of his travels, which Americans loved. So I'll just quickly make the point that the author of this little article I have a screenshot of here makes, which is that Americans seemed to really respond favorably to him, because even when he was talking about Arabs, he was making them feel good about being Americans. So this author is saying, Americans loved that his individuality, in italics, could not be destroyed even through all these intense travels and adventures. So Oskanyan, on the other hand, is trying to make Americans feel good about Ottomans, not about themselves. So it's quite a different pursuit. So Oskanyan also starts writing for American newspapers at this time. He clearly loves media, and he's taking advantage of all media. And he eventually becomes president of the New York Press Club, which weirdly I can find almost nothing about in their 19th century incarnation. These images are some example of some of his writing. In this instance, he's talking about the Armenians, the persecuted and suffering Armenians, including their history, and why, for example, the denationalizing tendency of Catholicism is antithetical to the Armenian National Church mentality. He also wrote anonymous columns for the New York Herald about, Middle East affairs. And so in all different kinds of newspapers from this period, you can see Oskanyan writing, whether named or anonymous. And a lot of newspaper writing at this time was anonymous. So in some ways, to see his name is actually more an unusual fact and an interesting fact that we can think about. So in 1857, Oskanyan wrote a book, which is in many ways used as a cover letter because he wants a diplomatic position at this time in the Ottoman Empire. So he starts sending this to all the people that he's checking in with about this position, including it with reference letters, including it with his inquiries about the position. For now, I'll just mention two things about this book. One is that he includes a pretty extensive section on the Armenians, who he says are the best, and the Greeks and Jews, who he does not speak well of at all. And then he also includes a section on the future of Turkey, which is extremely interesting. It's 1857. He provides significant advice for how Turkey can best be, quote, preserved and resuscitated. It's known as the sick man of Europe at this time. It seems to be struggling to sort of maintain its territories. He posits ideas like separation of church and state, decentralization, which is interesting because we could talk about this, but the Tanzimat seems to have a lot of a centralizing tendency. And so he's saying decentralize. And then he's also saying that Europe should be solicited for aid and assistance. He also says, and this is something you should sort of keep in mind for later, the nature of Mohammedan religion is not essentially in opposition to reform. This is important that he believes this at this time. And just to note the address here, his publisher is at 119 Nassau Street, which is downtown. Now, in March of 1858, Oskanyan served as the translator for the visiting Turkish admiral and his attendants. The left image is the cover of that Frank Leslie's issue. Oh, sorry. The scene on the right is him facilitating a meeting between the Turkish visitors, as they were called, and New York City Mayor Tiamin at the time. And the left is the cover of the issue this was in. And I actually purchased this very cheaply on eBay. So I have this little piece of history at home. I totally love it. And I love this image on the right because it's really showing Oskanyan between two worlds, literally facilitating the meeting and the conversation between these individuals. It's not in this image. I think I cut it out by accident, but it says at the bottom, photographed by Gurney at the bottom, who was a famous photographer and who will come across again in 1863. The meeting was at New York City Hall, which was by Nassau Street, right next to it. And it was also in quite lower Manhattan. There was actually a famous fire at the City Hall later in 1858 in the same year. This was in March. So now I'll just quickly mention that starting in 1856, he was looking desperately to get a diplomatic position. There's a bunch of letters in his file about this at the National Archives that are from Democratic New York politicians. The federal government did seem to be in favor of appointing Oskanyan, and yet the position was never made official, likely due at least in part to Oskanyan having a bad relationship with the translator, basically, of the American legation in Istanbul. And so periodically a newspaper would announce that Oskanyan had been appointed to some such position, like in this clip right here, but those positions were never actually instituted. So this actually is going to show up, this starts showing us a pattern of times where the newspapers maybe were publishing things that weren't actually true, or were maybe a little too, they rushed to get it out and then it never actually happened. And so as a historian, I often can't take anything I read as face value, which I can't do anyway, but particularly in the newspapers, I just have to, make sure I can confirm it in another source. So now starting in the early 60s, Oskanyan started to work at Columbia College. He appears to have served as both a janitor, which is very surprising to me, around 1861, as you can see mentioned in this diary entry by a man named George Templeton Strong, who is pictured here. I think he's kind of attractive for a 19th century guy. He was a lawyer and a famous diarist. This quote reads, Oskanyan, our Columbia College Law School janitor, wants a diplomatic position in Mesopotamia or that neighborhood. I know not precisely where. Probably the consul generalship at Alexandria, salary $3,500, which Thayer of the Evening Post seems to have secured. Gave him benefit of my political influence, so for so insufficient a janitor may make a brilliant diplomat, and I cheerfully contributed my mite to relieve the law school of a sweeper and maker of fires who knows so little of his profession. So it's quite funny that Oskanyan's a bad janitor at this time, which isn't surprising, but he clearly, I think he needed money. That's pretty evident in his letters also for this diplomatic position. By 1864, he seems to have become the library of the Columbia College Law School, which was a new school as of 1858. And both Columbia campuses were at 49th and Madison, which is much more uptown than we've seen to this point. So there's clearly a creep uptown over the decades. What time are we at? Okay. So in 1862, Oskanian tried again to build a Turkish bath in Manhattan. He really, really wants a Turkish bath in New York. He sells shares to subscribers that he puts in this newspaper, as you can see in this newspaper ad. It also says Oskanian can be seen at the Office of Vanity Fair, which is at 116 Nassau Street, which was right next to his publisher of the book from 1857. It also places his residence at 37 Lafayette Place, which we'll see again in the next few slides. This image is actually from his Oriental and Turkish Museum catalog, and it's of the Turkish bath. So that would have been very interesting to see in real life. So now, in 1863, his wife, Maria Luisa, serves as the corresponding secretary for the board of the new New York Medical College for Women, which is a new endeavor, and it was being established at this time. Fun fact, Elizabeth Cady Stanton was actually the recording secretary for this board, which I think is extremely cool. Her address, of course, is listed as the same as Oskanian's here, 37 Lafayette Place. And on this map on the right, this pink map, I've kind of just put arrows to a lot of the places we've seen mentioned or will see mentioned. And you can see that Oskanian at 37 Lafayette is like footsteps away from a lot of the places he would be working or attending events, et cetera, et cetera. And I just absolutely love this little source here because it describes how Oskanian gave a lecture on the women of Turkey at the Cooper Institute or Cooper Union in 1863, where all proceeds would be for the exclusive benefit of the New York Medical College for Women. So I just think that's so sweet that they worked together as a team, as a couple in 1863. And another thing worth noting here is that it describes how he used living specimens or models to create tableaux, like these little vignettes of scenes, and to display costumes. And so he's really entertaining his audience. I'm sorry, I don't have tableau myself tonight, but it seems like it really, really engaged his audience. So now these are inside views of that great hall in Cooper Union where he was speaking. He gave that lecture there, other lectures there. You can see on the left-hand side that Abraham Lincoln gave a very well-known address here in 1860. And I just love how these images evoke the size, the energy, the feel of what it would have been like to be at one of his lectures. And it's kind of interesting also how even over time, even this photograph, I forget what year this is from, but you can see it's kind of the same space and it's a big crowd. So it's very interesting. Cooper Union was off Astor Place, right? Again, in that area of the pink map where everything is located. So now, I always feel like this changes, like in Wizard of Oz, where it goes to color. Now we go to photography, and like all the visuals change significantly. So also in 1863, which was clearly a big year for Oskanian, which maybe I should emphasize was right in the middle of the Civil War, when the country was going through something extremely difficult that took up a lot of their attention. He started circulating these cartes de visite, these CDVs, which are basically like these trading card type things. He dispersed them of himself and others. So this woman actually, as another little piece of history I own, it's the Circassian girl. So presumably this was a woman who was on stage with him. We'll talk a little bit later how about some of his models might have actually been members of his family. So this might be one of his daughters, but I don't have concrete proof of that. But these images were taken by Charles D. Fredericks, who was another famous photographer at the time, who operated a famous studio on 585 and 587 Broadway, pictured in this middle image from 1858. He was known especially for taking CDVs and took them of many famous people, including P.T. Barnum, who was possibly one of the most famous faces at this time and who we'll talk about more shortly. So far, Oskanian has had his picture taken by basically the three most famous photographers of the time, which is a kind of interesting fact. So now, in 1863, Oskanian published an album of 23 photos of himself and what may have been his family members dressed in Ottoman costume. The photographer was Jeremiah Gurney, who you'll remember from the City Hall image in the newspaper, and he's also known for taking the only post-mortem photo of Abraham Lincoln in 1865. His studio was at 707 Broadway during this time. And this is a super interesting album. I'm going to show you a few more photos in a second. I just love this photo of Oskanian looking like, I don't know if someone can tell me what adjective comes to mind when they see this picture, let me know in the Q&A. I just think it's delightful. You'll also see how this top ad is from 1863 and the bottom one is from 1864. And one big change is that he says to prevent counterfeiting, each package is accompanied by his own autograph in 4 different languages, Turkish, Armenian, Greek, and English. So of course, I first love that this points to his language skills, but also maybe there were counterfeits going on, which would speak to sort of a level of popularity. This is an example just of another photo from the album and also how an image might be repurposed in a newspaper. And I would just love to find some of the newspaper images from earlier in their sort of initial form, if possible. So this is a little bit of a detour, which I think we have enough time to do, but I think it's really interesting that Oskanian talks about slavery, albeit not American slavery at this time. So he has an entry for slavery in Turkey. And given that this is a Civil War publication, I think it's worth just reading from a little bit. So slavery in Turkey is not a condition of perpetual servitude, but rather a species of apprenticeship. I think that's a little overstated, but it's interesting that he really is trying to say, like, slavery in Turkey is not as bad as what you people are doing here. Also, in terms of relating to slavery, is the Circassian slave image, which some of you might have heard of. This would have been a known figure to many Americans at this time, regarded as the epitome of white beauty and a lot of Orientalist imagery. This is Oskanian's entry for the Circassian slave girl. And then on the right-hand side is his use of advertising at this time for his related exhibition and lectures. And so it's clearly, he's now entering kind of a realm of spectacle that he hasn't really entered before. So he's saying, the Grand Turk and his harem of Circassian slaves are coming. I mean, I just find that kind of amazing that he's kind of using that language. So now, P.T. Barnum, who we mentioned, who's the famous / infamous New York City showman, who you may know now from the Barnum and Bailey Circus or the movie The Greatest Showman, he is often credited with bringing about the rise in popularity of the Circassian slave beauty in America when he brought in this woman who he called Zuluma Agra, a supposedly real Circassian woman who he rescued from slavery in Turkey, to his American museum in 1864. Not coincidentally, during the Civil War, when Northern Americans in particular had real deep anxiety about the figure of the slave. So this image, besides this woman being put on display in the museum, as a lot of Barnum's exhibits was also disseminated through these CDVs, these trading card type images. You can see very clearly this big hair, which is basically like an afro that an audience would at this time certainly identify as African. Which Barnum had them create by soaking their hair in beer and teasing it out to frizz and stand straight up. And this way, Barnum created this kind of liminal figure who was not quite a slave, but almost there. And it really appealed to this intersection of slavery, whiteness, womanhood that was very intriguing for people. And then this figure basically would pop up at dime museums, slideshows. They became a mainstay of entertainment till about the 20th century. And this wildly, wildly popular museum of Barnum's is in this picture right here, which I cannot get over this photo because it just really gives you a sense of life in New York at this time. This is an image from 1858. It's down right by City Hall on Nassau Street. So again, that kind of earlier hub of activity in New York. I just want to stare at the people on the street and just kind of think about how they're moving around the city. So now, I'm not saying this for no reason, even though it is pretty interesting. The image of Oskanian's Circassian slave girl was published in 1863, a year before Barnum's. In that same year, 63, Barnum made Oskanian an offer, and Oskanian declined. And so this is kind of described in the newspaper image from the left. The image on the right of the article is Barnum again talking at a lecture which Oskanian seems to have been in the audience for, called How to Make Money. And he again mentions that rejection. And in the middle is, of course, an image of P.T. Barnum himself. And that's who he called Tom Thumb, who he went around touring as, the real life Tom Thumb. He's obviously a very controversial figure, but he was extremely popular. So it's very interesting that Oskanian declined that offer. And probably says a lot about Oskanian's mentality. This is just really quickly to say that Oskanian's two daughters were known for their beauty. One of them was voted like the most beautiful girl in America. And so their wedding announcements were a big deal. I just kind of wanted to get that in there because it's kind of fun. In 1868, Oskanian was appointed the first Ottoman Consul General to New York City, soon after the first Consul General to Washington, D.C. had been appointed. In the course of his duties as Consul General in 1869, he facilitated the sale of guns to Turkey from the Winchester Arms Company, a part of which sale included a kickback deal for him. He was never paid his percentage and took the Winchester Arms Company to court, all the way up to the Supreme Court in 1881. He lost this case with a decision telling him basically that he was not only legally wrong, but also culturally and morally wrong. So he's actually a known name amongst legal scholars, and his case is actually cited pretty regularly. And then this is a panorama image that Oskanian himself took in Constantinople in either 76 or 78. So here he is still in his fez. The image from the Daily Graphic in November of 1876 claims he is an Armenian member of the new Senate of Turkey, which as far as I know wasn't true, but it's interesting. And it's really it's a grand display. It's like he got a full page, whatever it's called. And it's a beautiful image. It shows how he's aging. It shows how he's still wearing his fez. There's Ottoman writing on the bottom. I mean, it's a really interesting image. And the image on the left is a meeting of the first Ottoman Parliament in 1877. So now we're going to see, oh, sorry, I forgot to mention, or did I take it out? Oh, I forgot to mention the other slide. You see at the front that basically the Ottoman Sultan refuses to pay him for his service, and he quits the consulship in 74. He quits in disgust. There's a funny newspaper description of this as him on the boat and some pun with gust, like disgust or that gust. I don't know, I should have included it. But anyway, he quits in disgust in 74. I think the position was honorary, so the whole question of whether he should have gotten paid or not is questionable. And also when he's making his case to the Supreme Court, he's trying to argue that it was an honorary position, so he needed to take kickbacks because that was his income. So he's kind of speaking out both sides of his mouth at this time. But, just gives us more to figure out. So during the Russo-Turkish War, which is 1877 to 78, Oskanian is lecturing at some point on this topic. And at some point, an audience member asks him, is Russia better off? And Oskanian answers, because Russia's religion is one of improvement and Russia is amenable to the laws of change, yes, they're better off. Russia can be made better, Turkey cannot. This, you might note, is a big change from 1857 when he was saying Turkey could reform and that Islam was not opposed to reform. And I should also note here that he was anti-Russia in his 1857 thoughts as well. So his geopolitics had definitely clearly changed. Also, you can see in the newspaper description itself, I mean, he was always called an Armenian, but I think here he's being referred to an Armenian more and more, whereas you could see from the earlier coverage, he kept being called a Turk. So I think I have to do some more up close analysis of that, but there are some changes in language at this time. This is just a nice quote that I like from 1879. I cannot divest myself wholly of my Oriental preferences. I just think that's kind of interesting given his changing politics. This is another thing he's written about the Turkish bath. He still prefers the Ottoman Turkish baths, but he loves the Turkish bath. This is another one of my favorite sources from 1880 census, when Oskanian and Maria Luisa were living at 134 Baltic Street in Brooklyn. They've moved to Brooklyn at this point, so I think there was a move uptown and then there's a move to Brooklyn. It tells us that Oskanian's parents, about whom we know almost nothing, must have moved from Armenia, likely the Ottoman eastern provinces, to Constantinople in Turkey, where Oskanian was born sometime before his birth in probably 1818. So these columns here, it's asking, what's the state or territory of the United States or country if a foreign birth of yourself? So he puts Turkey, and then for both parents, he puts Armenia. So I think that description is very telling. because at that time, of course, there are no nation states yet, but there are distinctions made between Armenia and Turkey. So by 1885, Oskanian is encouraging Armenian immigration to, quote, show them an opening against Turkish tyranny and persecution. This is a little write-up he's done on the Armenians again, which he does periodically over the course of his life in New York. You can see it's actually a heavily illustrated newspaper clip. This is some of those images. So I think it's an Armenian lady embroidering an Armenian woman of Shusha, General, someone Russian, Milikov, and an Armenian banker. So he got some types and some figures. And then we're winding up now. He dies in 1895, which we'll get to in a second, but this is 1890. He starts an Armenian language newspaper, one of the very first in New York City, the Freedom national newspaper. The tag here reads, you know, the price of freedom is blood only. So we're getting, our politics are changing. And I find it very interesting quote here from one of the issues from 1890. He's writing about, they accidentally covered the death of Sultan Murad V, who ruled for 3 months only in 1876. And they're writing about sadness. And so he's saying, you know, indeed, we express enmity towards the Turks to the point of hatred, but our enmity is neither personal nor social, but merely political. Turks have persistently persecuted and exterminated Christians, and we will certainly oppose this Turkish conduct. We will be accused of not giving the pleasure of being slaughtered or sacrificed for fanaticism. So I think there's just this really interesting change, of course, but also a distinction between sort of political hate, which I know many of us can probably feel about some things these days, some not, but social and cultural love and affiliation. And it's something interesting to mine. So now he dies at 1002 Fulton Street in Brooklyn. He was buried at the Silvermount Cemetery in Staten Island. His tombstone again reads Oskanian in the Armenian letters, just like that first image we saw of his signature at the registrar in NYU. And so this is a sort of list of a lot of the addresses that we saw covered. I'm sure you've all just been aware of them. I've been pointing them out. And then I just reiterate, you know, what surprised you or stuck out to you? What were you finding most interesting? What changes did you see? What stayed the same? What did you note about geography, life, and business? And thank you so much for listening to me.
Thank you, Nora. That was awesome. Yeah. Here, I got to do my reaction again. There you go.
Oh, yeah.
So we can give Nora our virtual round of applause here. Thank you. That was so fascinating, so wonderful, and I really appreciate how you mapped things out for us as well. I actually a few months ago I took a walking tour of Ottoman New York that was, you know, all of kind of lower Manhattan, and so it was really fun to be thinking about some of that with Oskanian in mind. So I think you did a really wonderful job of kind of placing us in his New York, which is really wonderful. So
Thanks. I'm glad that came through.
So I want to open it up to questions, and what I think, because we're actually a wonderfully sizable crowd here, I love it. And so what I tried to do last time was I suggested in the chat, if you sort of signal your question, and people ended up just kind of writing them and then I was reading them. I don't want to do that. So I think if you just, if somebody has a question, because we're so many, just sort of say, I have a question in the comments, and then I will sort of call on you. And then you can say your question yourself as opposed to me reading it. So that might be a way to at least start the conversation. So if anybody has anything that they'd like to hear more about, just sort of signal that in the chat, and then you can ask about it. There is a ratio. That's true. But then I have to see everybody. There. Okay. Nurhan has a question. Okay, they're great. Nurhan, you should be able to unmute yourself, I think. There, I
think
unmuted you.
You
There you are.
unmute.
Okay. I excellent talk, Nora.
Thank
My
you.
question is, at the age of 16, 17, he's already writing about the Turks.
I know.
Very unusual. And the second thing that's very interesting is that he is coming in, at the age of 16, even before the Armenian Evangelical Church has been installed in Turkey, which doesn't happen until 1840s. And, where did he learn English? How, because he has an excellent language capability from what I can see. There are no American schools in Turkey at the time, because the first one, when you think of it, Robert College wasn't founded until 1863. And then all the other schools are not in Constantinople, but in Anatolia, in Aintab, in Marash, in those areas. So is there any information about him for his background?
Yeah, so I left, I guess, a lot of that out because I was trying to focus on New York with my time limits, but also because I don't know a ton. So the missionaries from the American missionaries first come to Istanbul in 1831, and he's at NYU by 1834. So my suspicion is that he's learning English either from the missionaries or maybe from a British contact. I have to do more research on this. But based on something he says in a lecture about Turkey in the 1830s, he seems to have lived with a European family for a bit. So I'm wondering if maybe he lived with a British family at some point. The British and the Americans were in close communication at this time. I was reading the other day about a fire. The Americans were experiencing one of the many Istanbul fires, and their house was basically being burned, and a British man comes and sort of helps them, and they stay with him. So there's a lot of connection there. To your point, there a lot of these official establishments started more in the 1840s after Oskanian is long gone. So I think he benefits from early, just real person-to-person interaction and enthusiasm. And he probably took some initiative. A lot of this is speculation, but he clearly seems like a very proactive person. They seem to have changed their agenda regarding two things. One, sending students to the United States, and two, conducting class in English. So I think actually Oskanian may have frustrated them because he didn't go back to Turkey and proselytize. He actually went and just had a successful career for himself. And so I think he's just an early example, an outlier in some ways. And I have a lot of questions about this period, like you do.
Because it's interesting that later on in the 40s and the 50s, American missionaries send a lot of students to the USA to become ministers and to, for Bible study and everything. And, it's amazing. Another thing that's very interesting, he's very pro-Turkish, which is very unusual.
Yes, he's both, it seems like. He says things that are anti-Turkey, he says things that are pro-Turkey. He definitely works in support of the Ottoman Empire. I've written a little bit about this. He seems to have his kind of own personal hierarchy, like Armenians are the best, I'm Armenian first, but I'm also Ottoman. Ottoman is also important in this way. And so it's kind of interesting, and I try not to flatten out those contradictions and just let them kind of sit with each other.
Good luck.
Thank you.
Joyce, did you want to ask a question?
Yeah. Hi, Nora.
Hi.
I'm Bixby. I haven't registered my name officially.
Hi, Joyce.
How are you? I was interested to know whether you're planning to write a book.
Yes.
Okay.
So I'm planning to write a dissertation and then a book. So.
Okay. And did you realize that was my father in the same picture in front?
I did. I don't know if you were around at the time, but I did say, I think there's someone watching who's, yes. I think he's in the upper right corner.
Yeah, well, yeah, I think he was, I think there was someone next to him, but they were cut off.
Yeah, okay. No, it was so nice that you're here and that I could share that.
To be here, this is so fascinating.
I'm glad.
I was curious to know about why in your dissertation you felt it was important to include so many addresses. Is there a
Oh, so this is just for this presentation, because I knew it was a New York crew. I thought it might be interesting to kind of talk about where he was in the city and just to show how close everything was. So, we think of New York now as kind of like unmanageable. You can be expected to go from Brooklyn to Harlem to do one thing. And this was really like a small neighborhood New York. And it probably facilitated a ton of contacts. I mean, you didn't just, you knew your neighbors, you talked to them, you saw them every day, you saw famous people left and right. And I think that probably made a big difference in the fabric and opportunities available to people.
Yeah. And the gentleman who made the comment about the, or say his ambivalence being Armenian and enjoying supporting what he loved about parents too. I mean, and they went through the genocide. So
Yeah.
It was a very mixed bag for them as well.
Right, exactly. I think you see that consistently over a lot of years, that mixed bag feeling.
Right. Thank you.
Emily, maybe you also had a question about New York neighborhoods, so maybe that's an appropriate time to ask that one.
Yeah, well, I'm a displaced New Yorker at the moment, so I really enjoyed that aspect of it, and it was a reminder that I owe you a picture of the Baltic Street address when I get back to Brooklyn. I wondered, you just spoke to the sort of cluster of meaningful addresses downtown near NYU and also in what's now the financial district. Is there an area of the city today that's sort of a hub of Armenian community or culture, or is it more dispersed?
I think maybe someone in the audience might want to answer that. Or Chris, do you want to answer that?
Yeah, it is a little bit more dispersed now. So I mean, if you visit, if you're in New York now, you'll notice that the diocese, the prelacy, and the evangelical church are all within about a sort of 5 to 10 minute little kind of circuit. And so that was a little bit later, right? So that sort of lower Manhattan area, which was kind of the Ottoman, Syrians, basically all kinds of Ottomans were down there in that lower Manhattan area for a long time. But it seems that actually quite early Armenians came up towards that 34th Street, Kips Bay, and that kind of area where all of that is located now. Today, we have a few people in the audience actually who are still sort of folks who are around that area, but a lot of it is more dispersed at this point. If anyone else wants to add, I don't know if Vartan maybe, that we have a Society for Armenian Studies Executive Council meeting, and Vartan was here. Vartan's still here. I don't know if Vartan has anything else to add to that from what I just said, or anyone else for that matter. There you are.
No, basically for what I have noticed is that area of the 27, between 27 and 39th Street. And I think that it's more around the 27th Street where Armenians, around the St. Illuminated Cathedral, where there was a big cluster of Armenian population, like in the 20s and 30s. And then little by little, they started, dispersing throughout the city or outside the city. And there are still people remaining there, but it's not the same as in the past, for what I have been able to know.
Yeah, and also shout out to New Jersey. There also is I'm from New Jersey. There's a move to New Jersey also that wasn't depicted.
Yeah, of course. I am from New Jersey too, so I have noticed that too.
So I'm the Armenians from New Jersey. There definitely is a push there. And I believe, though I'm not entirely sure, the printing of the newspaper, there might be some New Jersey association there. I have to think about that. But actually, even his family ends up moving to Hoboken and Jersey City in that area towards the late 19th century.
Joyce, did you want to add to that as well? You're one of our Armenian New Yorkers that's right in that area still.
I was going to reiterate what you said. Basically, when a lot of Armenians lived in that area, Lower East, in the 20s and 30s, part of the reason that the 27th Street Church even got built, because it was part of the community, and they had stores and shops. But like a lot of urban events, as they became more prosperous, they moved their families into the suburbs.
Yeah.
a long time. We don't really have an area where they cluster. You have people, neighborhood that, you know, I live like 4 blocks away from this person or 5 blocks away from that person, but there's no real, there's still a little Italy, Chinatown, but there is, that I know of, there's no really Armenian. Maybe up in Washington Heights there is, so way up on the west side, there's still Armenians that live up there. That might be the only area that's left in Manhattan.
Interesting. Yeah. Let's see here. Tallene, I think, is next. Tallene, do I have to? I don't think I have.
You got to unmute her too. It's the same problem that I had.
Yes.
I thought
Yes.
I let them unmute themselves. There you are.
All right, there. Yeah, well, actually, my question, first of all, Nora, excellent presentation. Thank you very much. This was very informative, and thank you. And thank you, Chris and the Zorab Center for hosting as well. My question is really about the descendants, which you almost hinted at in the last question. He had 2 daughters, and he passed prior to the genocide. Are there any descendants in the New York, New Jersey area that are living, and as they were, and would their opinions have changed as in the later years as a result of the genocide?
That's a great question. I also see someone in the comments who I don't know by the name says they can speak to descendants if interested. But there were 4 children, 2 boys, 2 girls. One of the sons, I believe, died early in 1866. I've seen that kind of referenced in 2 sources. And when he dies in 1895, he leaves 2 daughters and 1 son. I have been in a bit of contact with some descendants. They don't know much. I've also spoke to researchers who have spoken to descendants, say 10, 20 years ago now. And at the time, they might have known a little bit more. Maybe some of the older descendants who have died off knew a little bit more, but they seem not to know that much about their ancestor. I believe one of them even mentioned that they thought he went back to Turkey, which is not what happened. So there seemed to be some misinformation there. I know that some of the family, they kept married, you know, they kept, some became Mormons, I think. There's a Hawaii contingent, there was a DC contingent, definitely New Jersey. So it's a far-flung family. I haven't had much success on that front, but they definitely, you know, it definitely made it around the country.
Yes. Well, thank you. Thank you.
There's one. So I don't know the handle motto here. If they want to speak to descendants. Oh, I thought I unmuted. Uh-oh.
I think they were referring to the cluster of families, about 20 Armenian families that are living in Roosevelt Island. Yeah, or maybe, yeah.
There you are. You should be unmuted now. Why? There we go.
Oh, there.
Yeah, that was me. I was muted. I couldn't say anything.
There you are. Now you're there.
Hi, I'm Paul. I'm the one that was really excited to be around all these other people interested in this subject. I mean, I was just really enthusiastic to see that there was something about Oskanian, because I'm not like an academic historian, but I'm just one of those, I guess, armchair ones that, and so I really love early Armenians, and I don't know when I first started looking into Oskanian, but it was a while ago. And so I have been in contact with one descendant, maybe one that you've also talked to before as well, but something that I guess a question kind of goes in here too, because this one guy at least is very interested in his Armenian background. He says he's been to Armenia doing some relief work over the years, so he's actually been there. So I guess that's, you know, kind of a change from the others that don't really know much. And he says that he has in his possession a dagger that's said to have been Oskanian's, and there's allegedly a photo of him with it. So I'm curious if you know of any photos that he might be having a dagger in or anything like that.
Maybe let me quickly look at my slide. When he's speaking, Oh, I don't know. In the slide I showed you where he's at City Hall, the Turkish guests definitely have, like, it's not a dagger though, they're swords. I don't have a picture. I don't know about a dagger. I'd be fascinated if you could talk to your contact and sort of ask them more about that. If they're willing to share any information, that all sounds good to me.
I have to double check if he sent me the photo of it or just mentioned it, but he definitely has a photo of it and wants to find the corresponding alleged photo that may exist of him with this dagger, sword, whatever it is. But, and you mentioned the other son, Thomas, that died young.
You mentioned that. Interesting.
The reason that I know about him is because I saw you went to his grave, which I did too. That place is very, very discombobulated and disorganized because the actual marker was an obelisk, which was big during
the times. I know.
And the obelisk part has fallen. And I actually found someone who very much wanted to pay for it to be uprighted. And the place was so disorganized that despite multiple follow-ups saying, we will pay for this, we will do it, they're just like, sorry, like things are too crazy here. And, you know, I was in the office and I also have one of the reasons that I was interested in Oskanian is because I have a great uncle that's buried there as well. So one of the few Armenians also there is one of my relatives, but they literally lost him. They can't find his grave. They have no idea where my relative's grave is. But we did find Oskanian. So, but yeah, so we hope one day to upright his grave. And I love that it's in Armenian and everything on there. But on the obelisk, I noticed it said the name Thomas as well on the obelisk. And so that must be referring to his son who died in 1866, which means the grave plot goes back quite a ways. But yeah, I don't know. Anyway, that's a lot of my different.
And I noticed that, and that's when I realized that the death did happen, as I thought it sounded like it happened from a few newspaper articles. And I was wondering, it seemed unusual to me to have the name on the obelisk and then Oskanian on the base. I mean, I just kind of wanted to learn more about that process. And unfortunately, it sounds like the cemetery isn't organized and probably doesn't have good records, but there seems like there's something there to mine.
Yeah, they did pull out Oskanian's individual record for me because they have a catalog or like more of an updated thing, but that's for burials after 1900. So anything before 1900, like Oskanian, you've got to bring out these super old books. And because I knew his exact death date, they were willing to, all right, well, because I said, please just get out the 1895 book, let's go. And so they were willing to do that much. And so they did find him, but they meanwhile didn't, I couldn't see the exact plot listing of who's buried there or whatever. But it's strange because, Christopher or Kachik Oskanian is not on the obelisk, unless it's on the one that fell down, the side that's that we can't see, but Thomas is showing. But it would be odd that, they only had Thomas's name, and Thomas's name is in English.
Right.
While Oskanian, the name is in Armenian. So there's a lot of mystery there. And the records should exist, but they're just so disorganized. And the one time I went, they had a huge flood and they were just like, you could tell that they were way over their heads. So it's unfortunate, but they're
well, it's good. Top of my list once we can all have free range of motion again.
Yeah. And one thing, because you mentioned the whole slavery issue, that just random thing of interest, but certain sections there are like called the W sections, which actually meant white sections. And then there were like the B or I don't know which letter, but like it was an actual segregated cemetery going back to like, they had like colored or whatever sections and white sections. And I'm pretty sure that, Oskanian is in like the quote white section, but that, was a thing of question, up until even the 1920s about whether Armenians were actually white. So that's kind of, I think, an interesting note that he was there, but I'm sure the fact that he was married to, a woman from, an American family and all that, that's how he definitely assured his place in the white section. But anyway, that's another thing.
That's great. Thank you. That's very helpful. You can please email me after this.
I will.
Okay.
And I think Jennifer has a question. We'll take a couple more. Like I said, I actually, unfortunately, I now have a Society for Armenian Studies meeting after this. It's one would think that the sort of social life calms down a little bit, but I guess not. So Jennifer.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Nora, for your presentation, and shout out to New Jersey and Washington Heights Armenians. In one of the very last slides in your presentation, when it was talking about one of the talks that Oskanian was giving, I believe it said, I read really quickly, that 60 or 70 compatriots were there. And then it made reference to maybe it was 600 others. And I didn't see quickly enough whether that was 600 Armenians in New York or in the United States. And so my question is going towards what sort of sources, other than newspaper articles, are there secondary sources that you're able to contextualize him within the Armenian community in the United States? And what sources are you able to use?
Yeah, so just to read that for you, it says the speaker said there were over 600 Armenians scattered through the states. So that's in all of the states at this time. Yes. So yes, in terms of contextualizing, I mean, it changes, of course, throughout the century. So there are some classic books on Armenians in America, though I'm not always sure where they're getting their data from. So I kind of have to check everything because they go back a ways in some instances, and it's like, where's the footnote? Just tell me where you got this from. I'm also at some point going to try to go to New York records and see what I can find. For example, immigration records are much spottier before 1850 than they get afterwards. So I'm going to just try to compare to records, the secondary sources I have available. I don't know, do you have any suggestions of where else I can look for kind of data like that?
Not necessarily, but I believe my cousin Nancy, who works at the New York Public Library, is on the call here. So she might be a resource for you. Sorry, Nancy.
And I actually, maybe Nora, do you want to like type in your email in the chat or something like that? So if people want to get in touch with you, it's easy to.
Okay, yeah.
That might be one nice thing to do, because it sounds like you might get some good leads out of this.
Yeah, this is like a mystery. It is like a mystery, really.
Sylvie, did you want to ask your question? Did you want to?
Yes, thank you very much. It was really, really super interesting, and I enjoyed it a lot. I just was curious because he was doing so many different things. Did he ever graduate from NYU? I mean, he's supposedly a civil engineer. How do you become a civil engineer in 2 years? Maybe you did in those days. I don't know. And maybe they don't even have records that far back, because what was true, what wasn't true, you know?
Right. So as far as I know, he definitely didn't graduate. He was there for 2 years. That's attested to in different places. One is that NYU doesn't have a record of his graduating. Right. Two, letters. For example, his father-in-law wrote a letter as a recommendation letter for this diplomatic position he wanted, and he mentioned the 2 years of study. And he also mentioned that he served as a civil engineer under this man named General McNeil. I have to find out more about that character. I probably will not find much concrete proof about what he did in these 2 missing years between NYU and the resume and lecturing. But, I also actually don't know, maybe someone on this call knows if a degree was 3 years at this time, like it would have been in England and still is in England, or if it was a 4-year degree. I don't know in terms of in the 1830s what certifications looked like. I think you could get, a lot of people, he was called Professor Oskanian and on 2 years of college education. So like, I don't know what people were able to do. I'm going to
he may have just told people I'm Professor Oskanian and,
so it's just a
very professor, please.
Yes. Yeah. People, you had so many careers and professionalizations. You saw he put literature on that 1880 census as his occupation. So things were probably more flexible at the time, particularly in the 1830s. But it's a good question, and I do have more questions I need to find out about his education and what that looked like.
And did he presumably convert to become a Protestant?
Yes. So again, I don't have a single sentence that says he converted, but he presumably converted, and he does attend the Protestant church in the 1840s in Istanbul. And his father actually becomes the bookseller, like he sells Bibles in the bazaars in Istanbul for the missionaries. He dies in 1846.
Interesting.
And there's a big to-do about his Protestant funeral and how people are throwing stones and stuff at the procession. But then, of course, for the Ottoman historians in the audience, Protestants become a millet in 1850. So there's like this big change that will also be interesting to study. But anyway, it seems like the Protestantism becomes less important probably once he establishes his networks independent of the missionary networks, because really it doesn't really come into play much after the 1850s or in the 1850s onwards.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
And a comment from Lou, are those the parents? That's no. Why can't I unmute? Come on.
Oh yeah, Louise is my mom.
That's what I thought. All right, a comment from the parents.
Nora, based on what you said at home,
Yeah.
I think your New York focus has understated just how successful he was as a public speaker and presenter and lecturer. If you could tell a couple of the stories, like the Mississippi River story and the Springfield, Illinois story, I think people would realize that this guy was actually a big deal.
Okay, that sounds good. That's a good point. I actually thought that maybe, I left some stuff out. So the New York focus did take away from the fact that, for example, he goes out west, which is Ohio in this instance, in the 60s multiple times to give lectures. He really is a well-known speaker, and it becomes a big deal when he comes to, say, Springfield, Illinois, or somewhere in Ohio to give a presentation. And two very interesting stories. One is that he meets President-elect Lincoln when he's in Springfield lecturing. The two apparently, according to a source I have, become, fast friends. And there seems to be a rapport established there. And that is super interesting. And then actually after Lincoln dies, I found this little tidbit in a newspaper that says Oskanian wants to create a book of kind of the public memory of of Lincoln's death, which I actually think is really interesting because it shows he has this cognizance of like representation and public performance. And it's kind of meta in that way. And I don't think that book exists. I haven't come across it. I would like die if I actually saw that existent, but it's super interesting that he even had the idea. And then the other story that my dad alluded to is that there's a really fun anecdote in a letter from Ralph Waldo Emerson, where he and Oskanian crossed the Mississippi together in freezing cold weather in a skiff, which is a small boat. And this is actually the Mississippi by Ohio. They're both going to be lecturing in Ohio, I think. And so it's just these two men on the Mississippi River. It couldn't be more Americana in my mind. And here it is, this Ottoman Armenian in 1868. So it's just so sweet. And this is actually, I think, mentioned also in a newspaper from Ohio. So it's both in the letter from Emerson to his son and in the newspaper. It's very, very sweet. And they both like warmed their hands, or people warmed their hands for them when they got to the hotel in Ohio. So it's really, he just intersects with so much American history and so many interesting people. And the degree of closeness you could have at this time, I think, with other people is very interesting and maybe very poignant at this time of social distancing.
Edward.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Nora, and thank you, Chris. I'm a little bit ambivalent about this lecture. I don't know how to say it, but now we are just hours away of the genocide, and we're talking about a celebrity, Ottoman celebrity of Armenian ancestry. I think the major issue is that we did not even for a second, even for mention Armenian church. It's just unbelievable. I think that, I mean, you have an interesting kind of take on the Ottoman and the Armenian parts of a person. It's like I wrote to Chris, this like being an Ottoman and an Armenian in the same breath, like inhaling Turkish air and exhaling Armenian. But I'm just disappointed. It looks like he's much more Ottoman now after your lecture than Armenian. I mean, there is virtually almost nothing that you show he's an Armenian. I don't know how you're approaching him. Are you approaching him as purely academic? Okay, you're a student, you're graduating, you have to have a thesis, but what is there an Armenian breadth that we could pull out of him? I mean, he died just before actually the Abdul Hamid massacres. I mean, this is the first genocide. In fact, my family escaped the 1890s massacres from Turkey. And I don't know, I really wish you almost start this all over again. I mean, if you really want to emphasize he's more American than Armenian, I give you all the credit you want. But what's the point? Isn't there Armenian part in him? I mean, Gomidas was, I mean, he was, of course, a young person. He was probably a teenager at his time. But Armenia had this big culture and this big cultural presence in Constantinople. I mean, there was music, there was theater, there was actually Armenians were performing Shakespeare at the time. And there was so much Armenian stuff that he almost missed. I mean, I really don't understand. I really think, you know what, you might be making it to start this myself. Because I think we're missing the Armenian part. We just
but I think that part of what we have here is that he is what he was. You know, I mean, you have the historical.
No, I don't think that.
I think Nora, what is your take on that? I mean, I think
it brings up a lot of interesting questions. I actually do think his Armenianness really. He actually brings it up pretty consistently throughout his life, whether it's using Armenian, whether, you know, his first lecture in the States is about Armenia and talking about Armenian history and talking about about Noah and the ancient boundaries and the importance of the Armenian character. And I didn't include all of it because I was trying to go very fast. But I think it's actually a constant in his narrative. And in some way it's his politics that change about what it means to be an Armenian. But I think to your point, we also have to ask what it means to be an Armenian. I mean, is Armenian just the church? Is it the language? A lot of Armenians we know in the Ottoman Empire were Turkish speakers. So what made them Armenian? It's an interesting question. And so I think...
Yeah, no, I'm sorry, I know we shortcut, but you have this very interesting thought. I would have never thought that there would be a lecture on Ottoman Armenian in New York. And the idea is, well, when you mention Saroyan, William Saroyan, do you think of it as an Armenian or as an American? In other words, there is that part. When you, on the other hand, when you think of Gomidas, I mean, he was born in Turkey and he was, of course, educated in Europe or in Soviet, in Armenia, but we never kind of want to think of him as an Ottoman. Never, ever will think of Gomidas as an Ottoman. And here
that's us. That is us thinking about him. I want to be really clear that that's us thinking about him. And I think Nora has done a really excellent job of looking at what he has said about himself and about how how he was portrayed at the time. Ara, I think Ara is going to hop in. Ara, what?
All the best. Good luck.
Ara.
Thank you.
Oh, I thought I unmuted you, Ara. Where did
yeah.
you go? Oh no, so many people. Where did Ara go? There you are. Unmute.
Then he has to add to the unmute too, I think. It was kind of complicated.
There you are.
Hi, Chris. Hi, Nora. Hi, everyone. Congratulations on a great event.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask Nora about your upcoming work, actually. What else are you working on? What can you tell us? But I also just thought of something also, that this conflicting identity between Ottoman and Armenian, and I think as Chris mentioned, is probably now more in our mind that the two are not compatible. We've had people like, I would say the finest example would be probably someone like Krikol Zorab, for which the center is named, right? He was both Ottoman and Armenian, right? And both were quite developed, and both identities were quite developed. And he contributed to both worlds extensively. But tell us about your work.
Yeah, no, and I think that's a fair point. I think with the Ottoman and Armenian, I mean, we have to just know what we mean by Ottoman and Armenian. And a word I really like to use when I think about these is affiliations. So when is he having Ottoman affiliations? When is he calling himself a Turk? When is he affiliating with the Armenians? When and why are he making these affiliations? And what are they providing for him or explaining for him or those sorts of things? In terms of future work, I mean, this is my work for the next few years, my dissertation and hopefully the book. But I am working, for example, on, he published a newspaper in 1840-41 in Istanbul, which is a very early newspaper in the Ottoman Empire. It was written in Armeno-Turkish, and I'm working with a woman in Turkey about kind of translating and annotating 2 issues of that and kind of making that a wide audience resource. So people can see what was covered and maybe how to go about reading a newspaper like that. And similarly, with the same woman, we're working on a translation of one of what's known now as the first Turkish novel, which was actually written in Armeno-Turkish, which is Turkish written in Armenian letters. Oskanian makes a claim that he wrote this novel. I don't think it's accurate, but it's interesting that he claims that he wrote it. It's an interesting novel about Armenians, Armenian Catholicism. It's a satire, and we're working on the first English translation of that. So right now I'm kind of doing a lot of work, dissertation first and foremost, but in addition to that, kind of projects that Oskanian opens up, because he opens up so many projects. Sometimes it's a little bit like, can't do all this at once, but they do all interconnect. And part of what makes him a great topic is that he just opens up so many doors and yet unifies them at the same time. So the gift that keeps on giving.
And I think, Nora, maybe your future work is a perfect place for us to end the evening. And it sounds like you've got hopefully some good leads from this, and hopefully, questions that will help you as well, because I know I think we all really appreciated this, and it was really fun to imagine such a character in New York. I mean, New York seems to always find characters, or characters find New York, and it seems that our Ottoman Armenian here was the same there.
Thank you so much.
So really quickly before I close us out here, I just want to make a couple comments. I'm hoping to have a couple more events still here with the Zorab Center. Actually, in 2 weeks, hopefully, we'll have a screening. We'll see how that works, of a short film documentary called Motherland about women deminers in Artsakh, and the directors hopefully will be joining us. So I know many of you are new tonight. If you are interested in any of our future events, you had to RSVP with me through the Zorab email. If you just, on that same little email thing, if you just sort of say, hey, I'd love to be added, I will get you to make sure that you're on the rest of our mailing list so that you can join us for future things. And then the only other thing I would say is that, this is I'm thrilled that we get to keep offering programming. And, it's a time where things are tight for everybody, but I just, I encourage everybody to think about, where their support goes. Obviously I'm saying, think about me and my center, but I would also put a plug in for one of my favorite New York institutions, which I think is directly relevant to our topic here, which is the Tenement Museum, which talks about immigration. And I think it's one of the great New York and actually institutions, period, especially for thinking about, like I said, immigration and immigrants. So, just a little plug for thinking about what you can and could support in this time. And with that, one more round of applause for Nora. So thank you very much.
Thank you guys. I really, really appreciate, you were such a great audience. It was my first talk ever, first solo talk, so I really appreciate that.
Well, and via Zoom, that's impressive.
Via Zoom.
All right. Take care, everyone. We hope to see you in 2 weeks, and keep an eye out for those emails.
Bye, guys.
Bye, everyone.